Hi, this is part two of a lecture on the Frankfurt School and Introduction to Critical Theory, talking about the Dialectic of Enlightenment. And we're going to go through the Dialectic of Enlightenment by introducing some of the key ideas here. My name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm a professor of philosophy at Providence College. And last episode, we looked at some of the background to the Frankfurt School. So we looked at the concept of enlightenment in Kant. Then we looked at this idea as it develops in relationship to alienation in Hegel. We also looked at the concept of bureaucracy in Max Weber and the concept of reification in Georgy Lukács. So what we're set up for now is to understand how the Frankfurt School puts these concepts together, particularly in the document, The Dialectic of Enlightenment. And I will try to focus my concepts particularly on the chapter on the culture industry. So one of the ideas here is to see capitalism as a historical development of the reification of human relations, so that bureaucracy and conformity are primary sources of repression. So going back to the ideas that we just went through, right? Reification is another form of the lack of enlightenment, right? We reify our relationships so that they conform to society, they conform as things, and things, of course, cannot think for themselves. And we do not resist this reification because we are either lack the courage to think through it, or we lack the desire to think through it. Right, so going back to Kant and Mill on that idea. But of course, Kant and Mill accept capitalism. So this is a new understanding of what's really going on in capitalism. And to understand capitalism as part of a historical process is what the Frankfurt School is trying to do. So they're going beyond Marx in this sense, right? Marx sees capitalism as a particular historical development, but Marx was writing 75 years ago from the perspective of Horkheimer and Adorno. So they want to re-examine capitalism, not simply just in terms of market relations, but in terms of the reification of human relations that goes on throughout history. And this reification, of course, is part of the master-slave dialectic that we talked about with our good friend Hegel. So bureaucracy then, right, becomes one way that we conform to society, and conformity itself is a primary source of repression. How do we hold people down? Right. So you may, of course, disagree with this kind of understanding of capitalism. You might disagree with what bureaucracy does. You might disagree about conformity and its value. But the idea here is to try to understand what's really going on in the dialectic of enlightenment. And this is the perspective from which they are starting, a synthesis that comes out of Kant, Hegel, Marx, Weber, and Lukács. So who are the Frankfurt School? Well, the Frankfurt School is the name that we give to an institute in Frankfurt on Main, the University of Frankfurt. It's the Institute for Social Research, started in 1923 and still exists today. The people that we identify with the Frankfurt School are people who were part of that institute and continue to be part of that institute. And we're really focused on the original members, the first generation Frankfurt School. Usually when we talk about later generations, we just use the term critical theory. So we're looking at people who were exiled from Germany from 1935 to 1949, from the rise of Hitler to the end of the war. And in particular, in this discussion, we're going to look at Max Horkheimer, who was the director from 1930 to 1953, so through the exile period. We're also looking at Theodor Adorno, and we might bring in Herbert Marcuse, mainly because of his ideas about culture itself. Horkheimer was not the first director of the Institute for Social Research, but he really put his stamp on the kind of research that they did. And it's Horkheimer who is really the brain behind the dialectic of enlightenment at first, because it's based on many of his earlier writings, and Adorno comes in and they collaborate together to finalize and refresh and revise those writings. And of course, much of the stuff that is in the DOE is also part of Adorno's original work as well. So it's not just one person's writing, but it was at first Horkheimer's idea. To understand what's going on here with the Frankfurt School, we have to put them in their historical context, which I've been trying to do as we've gone along, right? So the first one is the rise of fascism in Europe, right? And this includes the rise of Hitler, obviously, but what is the working class's role in that, right? How is it that Hitler was elected in some ways in a democracy? And tied to that is the failure of the oppressed working class in industrialized countries to actually follow through on Marx's idea that they would rise up and overthrow capitalism. So for Horkheimer and Adorno, right, the idea that Marx had that the oppressed would rise up and throw off capitalism would be a sign of enlightenment. And the fact that they have not done that seems to be a lack of enlightenment. And the further fact that they are part of this rise of fascism seems to show that there is a lack of our ability to think for ourselves. Again, we should remember that this is a personal issue for the Frankfurt School scholars, not simply because they were exiled, but because they had concrete connections to the horrors of the Hitler regime. And they had friends who died from this, right? They had friends who were executed. We also know that Marcuse worked for the U.S. Intelligence and State Department against the Nazis, particularly in terms of trying to figure out how do we undermine what they've done in terms of propaganda to the German people, and how do we recover from this, okay? The goal here then of the Frankfurt School is to understand the psychological and cultural reasons for the developments that Marxism itself cannot be explaining, right? And so to understand that so that we can move to a more humane society. And that's why it's important to understand Hegel and to understand Weber and Lukács for them. If we want to think more generally about what critical theory is, in the words of our good friend Horkheimer, it's the goal is to liberate human beings from circumstances that enslave them, right? So how we understand what liberation is and how we understand what those circumstances are will impact the actions that we do. And so what critical theory is trying to do is take a particular theoretical stance here and look at how traditional theory, in fact, enslaves people, right? Because it abstracts from human life and reduces human beings to numbers. So if you are part of any of the social sciences, including economics, or a part of the business world, you know that human beings are abstract entities, right? We think about them in terms of their economic relations or other social relations, not as people with histories and backgrounds, but as people engaged in particular actions. And so what critical theory wants to do is undermine that understanding of the human being and put them back into their concrete context. So it examines a definite individual in his real relation to other individuals and groups and his conflict with a particular class, and finally in the resultant web of relationships with the social totality in nature. So again, we think here about what are our relationships to others, right? And that's often missed in some of the social science that goes on today. The goal here then is a moral goal, right? How do we liberate people? How do we help people liberate themselves? And not an instrumental goal. And that certainly defines what traditional theory is. Traditional theory is instrumental, right? How do we understand these social relationships so that we can control them and make life better according to our ideas of what better is, right? So we understand economic relations as instrumentally a way to make human life better. And what critical theory is trying to do is we can't do that without understanding individuals in terms of their groups, their classes, and the relationships that they're in, both with those classes and with society in general, and also with nature. And I think it's important to remember that critical theory here is bringing in our relationship to nature as a fundamental aspect of both coming to enlightenment and also the lack of enlightenment. So, as I've been saying, what critical theory is trying to do here is critique social science, right? Traditional theory, sociology, psychology, political science, economy, etc., reduces people to data points. And you can hear this in the political stories today, right? this and this many people are unemployed, right? And so there's no discussion of the history there. How did they become unemployed? There's no discussion of the cultural context. If this person is depressed, why are they depressed in this particular cultural context? There's no discussion of the consciousness that these individuals share, right? Social science objectifies people, right? They're raw material that we use to maximize profit, right, and enforce domination. How does that happen? How, in what ways does social science do that? And then finally, social science reinforces the status quo, right? Social science does not typically ask how do we change the underlying relationships, but how do we use those to make society better under some other idea? How do we get those relationships to work better, right? And so what Horkheimer and Adorno and Marcuse are trying to do is argue that we need a critical social science that questions the status quo, okay? And again, that goes back to the idea of enlightenment, right? Enlightenment is about questioning, and alienation is about the lack of question. So it's not about whether we use statistics or not, but rather how are those tools used to legitimize certain forms of social control. Right? So one of the ideas that we want to bring in here is that there's no longer any available form of linguistic expression which is not tended toward accommodation to dominant currents of thought, right? And we see this in art. You can recognize this as a famous piece of art. And we see this in all forms of society, that there is a lack of questioning the status quo. And for Horkheimer and Adorno, this goes back to our really linguistic expressions that we have. How do we talk? We talk about economic relationships. What are their benefits? What are their deficits to us in terms of our friendships, in terms of art, in terms of education? Education pays, right? And so what the DOE is challenging is that kind of relationship that we're going to bring in from industrialization. So what they want to say is that underlying capitalism is a system of domination, a domination both of human beings and of nature, and that this domination is about the reification of human persons. How do we look at the relationships between human persons, not as relationships between peoples with history and culture and identity, but relationships of industrialization, relationships of objects to each other, of things, okay? And this really goes back to, for Horkheimer and Adorno, a particular conception of reason, instrumental rationality and formal rationality. And you can explore that as you read through the Dialectic of Enlightenment and the Culture Industry. So in this world, the self becomes meaningless because it's mechanical. Well, we lack any kind of sense of meaning in our lives. So freedom becomes a myth, right? We have no control over our lives. It's controlled by the government or by the economy, right? And if we lose our jobs, that's just best for the economy. And so there's a lack of what freedom really means there. Freedom becomes mythical because it's freedom of the economy and not of people. And so, again, there's a failure to think outside of the system of domination, of these mechanical processes. And again, when I'm talking about mechanical there, you have to think about industrialization, right? It's a mechanical process. And that's what the artwork that we looked at last time was. That was produced as a mechanical process. So that brings us into this chapter of the culture industry and some of the ideas that you want to think about and questions you want to ask in relation to that chapter. So what do they mean by culture industry? What does it entail? And it's not just simply Hollywood, but it's a lot more than that. But Hollywood becomes one of the standard ideas that they're talking about here. How does this culture industry mimic and confirm industrialization, right? And so what I ask is that you think about concrete examples here, okay? How does the culture industry turn values into value or a marketing tool? Again, and think about concrete examples here. And so you can think about the movie Thank You for Smoking, the relationships that Nick Naylor has there, and there's a picture of his relationship with the person who writes a story about him. But you can also think about the kinds of ways that we advertise things. You can't buy happiness, but you can buy tea, and that's kind of the same thing, right? So how does the culture industry impose capitalist values on us? And so how are people both aware of this culture industry and how it inculcates these certain values, and yet also critical of them.